I'm very pleased that for tonight I get to introduce, once again, because he talked to us in 4 years ago, I think it was, Dr. David Anderson, who's recently retired, so now a professor emeritus in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, although he's coming to us from his home in South Carolina tonight, as I recall. Dr. Anderson received his BA from Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, and then he went to the University of Arkansas for his MA, and then the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor for his PhD. For many years, until 2004, he was basically doing CRM archaeology, after which he left for the academic position at Tennessee. He has participated in and run many major CRM projects, which have resulted in a plethora of significant academic and technical publications. I think the last time I counted, he published 50 books and technical monographs alone, including several I reference all the time when I was writing more stuff anyway. Notably, 2 books he co-edited with Ken Sassaman on the Paleoindian and Early Archaic Southeast and the archaeology of the Mid-Holocene Southeast. Aside from his prodigious writing output, what impresses me that he's done significant work running the gamut of all time periods, from exceptional paleo work right up to Mississippian times in the Southeast. Dr. Anderson is truly, as I like to say, a scholar of international reputation. I know of him, and I'm a Canadian. Okay, and he's been recognized by his receipt of numerous awards. Notable examples include his receipt in 1999 of the Society for American Archaeology Excellence in Cultural Resource Management Award for research, and in 2018 the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Southeastern Archaeological Conference, and a crowning achievement, I think, for any USA scholar, being elected in 2014 as a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. One of his earliest awards was actually in 1991 for his doctoral dissertation from the University of Michigan, which was awarded the Society for American Archaeology Dissertation Prize for Excellence that year on Mississippian societies. One area in which he has done a lot of research concerns large research databases and their development and use. And these databases allow one to explore in detail many aspects of past settlement and land use at a very broad scale. He organized and has maintained for years what's called PIDBA, or the Paleoindian Database of the Americas, which is freely available online and documents the location, distribution of fluted points and sites at a continental scale. They're constantly being added to as new discoveries are made. For his talk tonight, he's going to cover, I think, something that relates to this at some level, these large databases, the distribution of archaic period sites over all of the southeastern United States, looking at changes through time and the possible causes of the changes in settlement and land use patterns over that time. So it's my honor to turn the meeting over to him now.
It's an honor to be here. I've known some of you for a long time. Some of the names are familiar, and others are not, but I've appreciated Chris for a very long time for his work in Paleoindian, and some of the others for more recent work. And thank you again for inviting me. This paper reflects work that I did with my colleague Shane Miller at Mississippi State University. Shane was an MA student of mine at Tennessee and got his doctorate at Arizona, and then Andy White from Indiana, who's now with the Illinois Archaeological Survey, who's done Paleoindian in the upper Midwest. So this is a team effort, and what I'm going to be doing is looking at archaeological site distribution across the Southeast and coming up with some observations of what we've come up with. Now, 30 years ago, at the Southeastern Archaeological Conference, a session was held on the archaeology of the Mid-Holocene Southeast. Ken Sassaman and I put this session together, and the next slide I'll show you will be the cover of the book, one of the ones that Chris mentioned that Ken and I did. But at that meeting, I gave a paper on looking at regional settlement across the Southeast in the early, middle, and late Archaic periods. Let me see this. This was published in 1996 as a book, The Archaeology of the Mid-Holocene Southeast. And this paper that I'm giving to you tonight, which was also given at the Southeast Conference in November, is an update on that 1996 93 analysis that was published in 1996. It's again looking at big data from across the Southeast. The 1996 sample was basically all the known sites in the Southeast at the time. There were 179,000 some sites from 10 states that we used in the analysis. And the numbers are here. And by the way, these slides will be available to anybody who would like them. The primary data behind them will also be available. That's in the acknowledgement slide. Where did that data come from in 1996? Well, it was provided by file managers. State archaeologists and site file managers shared the data quite willingly across the region. And at the time, it was showing us that settlement distribution was uneven across the region. Some of it was related to survey coverage. But in that 96 paper, a number of different patterns were observed. Now, just to give you an idea of the kinds of analyses that were done back then, this is a distribution, a choropleth map of Southeastern early archaic sites by county as percent of all sites in that county. There were 7,000 sites. Louisiana was a problem at that time because many of their early archaic sites they called Paleoindian. They were calling basically corner notch and side notch forms Paleoindian. They were San Patrice, they're called San Patrice locally. So there are taxonomic issues with using any of this data. We use the data classifications the site file managers give us, and we try to proof them as best we can. But again, this is just a map showing the sites in the early and then the middle archaic, about 10,000 sites, and then the late archaic, 14,000 sites. Since the mid-90s, our data has improved markedly and also our mapping capabilities. So I apologize for the quality of the image. It was actually better at the time, but this is what a black and white publication will do for you. I appreciate we can publish in journal articles and use coloring. But basically, you can see, going back over those maps, that there's an infilling of the landscape. Well, in 2023, Shane Miller and several other colleagues said, well, we want to update the Mid-Holocene Southeast book. They just did an update of the Paleoindian and Early Archaic Southeast book a couple years ago. And moving on, they said, well, the Mid-Holocene hasn't been looked at in a long time. So they asked me if I'd be interested in being involved. And I thought about it and said, well, what about if I update the paper from 1996? Because I enjoy working with big data. And they said, sure, that'll be good. And Shane and Andy White, in fact, wound up helping me. So there were 179,000 sites in 1996. 30 years later, we have almost double that, 390,000 sites. And we added one state, Virginia, to the mix. And then we added, I said, well, early, middle, and late archaic are fine, but let's look at Paleoindian and early woodland as well, because there's some interesting things going on over time. And I'd ultimately like to do this over all time periods, but enough, is enough. Basically, where did this data come from? It's provided by state archaeologists and site file managers from across the region. Much of this was in a database that my colleagues and I maintain online called the Digital Index of North American Archaeology. There's data sets from many states across the United States. We don't have data from Canada and DINA. We do in PIDBA, but we've gotten people from a number of Canadian provinces who said, well, if you expand this, we'd like to be involved. But what was interesting was in DINA, we did not have at the time of this analysis data from Arkansas and North Carolina in final form, or from Mississippi. So we were able to contact the site file managers of those states, and we got updated data, basically. For the first time, we got Arkansas data by period, and Mississippi. I had it in the early 90s, but we didn't have it entered into DINA yet. And then the data in North Carolina that's in DINA is actually only 1/5 of the site file totals, because what they were able to load into DINA 10 years ago was actually only a partial sample. So the data sample is much larger now. And sorry, it's a little small, but in the lower right is a map of sites by elevation above sea level. And the red are sites within a meter of current main sea level. It's a paper that a number of colleagues and I did in 2017 in PLOS One, showing that there are large numbers of sites that'll be flooded by sea level rise. So these type of analyses can tell us important things. So what are major features of this 2023 sample? Again, the site distribution is a reflection in part of survey coverage. And you can see from the map that sites are unevenly distributed across the region, although you can see that there are large numbers of them, 4,000 in some counties or more. But this requires some challenges, standardization for interpretation. Now, if you're wondering what some of these concentrations are, they're basically where intensive federal government-funded surveys have occurred more than anything else. It's where development occurs. And what used to be Fort Bragg, now Fort Liberty, what used to be Fort Polk, now Fort Johnson, and so on. Fort Moore used to be Fort Benning. There's been tremendous amounts of work that's been done on those installations. And that's where some of these concentrations fall out on the landscape. Now, if that's all we had to go with, you'd think, well, the concentrations are where the military and national force were and so on. As you'll see, standardization helps us overcome some of that. Now, one thing is there's still considerable variability in the total number of sites per period between the states. For example, in the Paleoindian, we have 3,000 sites, and you can see for Middle Archaic, North Carolina has literally far more sites than any other state. We'll come back to that. It doesn't mean that the most culturally complex groups were in that state. It was an adaptation that just had widely ranging over the landscape and leaving a lot of small sites behind. And then states like Kentucky, sort of home of the shell-mound Archaic, among a lot of others. And now I'm going to take Andrew White's analysis, which is, what do radiocarbon dates tell us? We looked at three things. We looked at site distributions, we looked at pollen, and we looked at radiocarbon. And what Andy did was he looked at radiocarbon dates from across the region. These are in CARD, the Canadian Archaeological Radiocarbon Database, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. And he basically went through and examined radiocarbon dates from southern states in terms of, did it have a lab number? Did it have error bars under 200 years or under? Are they archaeological deposits as opposed to paleontological and geological? So basically, he was cleaning the data set to see how many dates could be perhaps used to measure populations during different time periods. And his data set came up with 1,790 radiocarbon determinations that met these criteria from 10 states. Here's all of them. Now, we didn't get Arkansas as of yet. They have a lot of radiocarbon dates, and we haven't finished cleaning up. So stay tuned for that. But these are the radiocarbon dates, and you can see again, there are some areas where there just hasn't been a lot of dated sites. And it's showing areas where archaeologists spend a lot of time and perhaps where they don't spend as much time. There's a lot of things going on. Here are Paleo-Indian well-dated sites from the region. This is Paige Ladson. Some of these can be related to one or a very few sites. This is Dust Cave, which you may hear about in 2 months if Chris is able to get the speaker. Remarkable site, 14 feet of stratified deposits from Paleo-Indian through Late Archaic. So on these maps, in some cases, you can really just pick out the sites. Like this is the Little Tennessee River Valley where Jeff Chapman helped us date the archaic sequence. Again, Dust Cave, it's in that particular county, so the dates are showing up there. This is the Conley site in northern Louisiana. There are just a number of well-known sites there. Middle Archaic, and again, just site distributions. You're seeing, again, trends towards coastal areas. That's occurring in the Middle Archaic, greater filling of the landscape. And then the Late Archaic, lots of dated sites across the landscapes except for the Gulf Coastal Plain. For whatever reason, there's not a lot of dating in this area. And I suspect there will be more in this area across from Poverty Point, the Jaketown Poverty Point area. Some of those dates are very old, though. And so if you're looking for some sites, if the dates are more than 30, 40 years old, they may have been run on solid carbon and may not be very, very accurate. Here's the early woodland again. Again, a drop in numbers. And what's interesting is Georgia has few archaeological sites, but more radiocarbon dates than South Carolina. This is the late Archaic and early woodland. So there may not be a lot of sites in Georgia, but the ones that have been found are very well dated. Okay, so what does this all mean big picture wise? And this will be wrapping it up over the next 10 minutes or so. Basically, there's a clear pattern of increase over time. You can see that radiocarbon dates, they support the site information in terms of demographic trends. And then we do see when they're standardized, numbers of counties producing dates, you see that from Paleo to Early Archaic, there's an increase. There's actually a bit of a decrease in the Middle Archaic. With the site numbers, it's more of a slight increase. 4,000 years ago, the late Archaic onset, 5,000 to 4,000 years ago, people are everywhere on the landscape. And then the early woodland, again, we're getting drops in the numbers of sites. So a couple of independent lines of evidence are showing these trends. Now, what are scenarios for this? Well, there are three that we're going to talk about here briefly. The simplest scenario for what's going on over the region is a gradual increase over time. There's no question that's occurring. But then a more complex scenario is that there's boom-bust cycles at a regional scale, where you'll have patterns of extreme growth, leveling off, and then more extreme growth. We can see a little bit of that, but what's perhaps a more accurate description is you have population boom-bust cycles, but they're occurring in a number of different locations. And remember, there's the data, it's the state level, and then we look at the distributions. There's a lot of different things going on over the landscape. Some areas are having large numbers of sites, while others, site numbers are declining. So there's no doubt that the increase is occurring over time. But this seems to be the more likely explanation for what we're actually witnessing. There are a number of asynchronous boom-bust cycles occurring over the course from the Paleoindian to the early woodland. So these patterns have been noted in other studies in Eastern North America and in other parts of the world. George Milner looked at ratios of cultigens to nut mass, cultivated plants to wild plants, and then he looked at site count data, primarily from the Midwest, to show another way of looking at this data. And again, patterns of increase, and then followed by some decrease. This is later in the woodland in George's analysis. Shane Miller looked at a number of different variables in the South, everything from size of bifaces to numbers of bifaces, sites, the presence or absence of things like shell middens and mounds, and so on, to again argue for population booms followed by declines. In the Rocky Mountains, Bob Kelly and colleagues looked at things like temperature and moisture, and then radiocarbon determinations. This is some probability distributions of the dates. And again, we're seeing human populations are not level, they're not stable. They do tend to fluctuate up and down. Some of this may be die-off, some of this is also probably movement, but there are fluctuations in human populations over time that are occurring as reflected by these proxies. So another study for the mid-Holocene is from Europe, and that's interesting as well. Some probability distributions are showing the same sort of thing. Basically, crash boom cycles are occurring, and these different colored lines reflect different areas in Europe. So again, what we're seeing in the Southeast, and if we added the Midwest and your area, probably the same thing. People aren't just living the same way over time. Well, we knew that, but this is more quantitative analysis. Now, the European analysis that appeared last year in Nature, they did analyses looking at what could cause this. They looked at climate variation and they looked at intergroup conflict. And it appears that those could very well be pretty determinative, meaning that they have a lot of influence in why we see people moving, why we see population growth and crashes. So to conclude, the early and mid Holocene and later Holocene Southeast was a very dynamic social landscape. The trends are comparable to those in other parts of the world. Important questions that we need to explore is what causes these changes? What causes these boom-bust dynamics to play out and why? And conflict, climate change. I think interaction networks, ceremonialism also play a pretty pronounced role in this. If we're going to answer these questions, at least explore them this way, we need to continually work on our regional data set. It's something I've been working with site file managers for a lot of my career, the last 30 or more years. Get better control of time or space, meaning we've got to be better at recognizing temporal diagnostics and always get more radiocarbon dates, AMS close interval. Now, CRM, a subject area near and dear to my heart since I've been doing it my whole career. And even when I became an academic, I still did CRM projects. This is an overview of Fort Pogue. I literally finished last year. There's nothing like having thousands and thousands of sites and artifacts to work with. So this is a temporal diagnostic. Evans Point, it's very conveniently notched in the middle of the blade. So it's very easy to recognize these forms. That's a hallmark of the early mounds in Northeast Louisiana. Watson Break, 5,000 to 6,000 year old mounds. This is the point type that is occurring with, and it's occurring across Louisiana into Mississippi. We need to take the CRM data we've collected and use it to help us better assign period assignments to sites. So to conclude, we've come a long way just in the last 30 years. 30 years before that, we only had a couple thousand sites in the Southeast. Now we have pushing 500,000. As I always say, we need to update our site file data and support your local site file managers and site files. And that's it. Those are my acknowledgments. Again, site file managers are our friends. I really appreciate people contributing. And then the DINA team, a lot of colleagues. It takes a village to do analyses like this, to pull this data together. Years and years of people contributing to it, site file managers maintaining it, and then a team of people in manipulating it. So if you're interested in more, the data will be included as supplementary materials. The 2017 PLOS One data has all the site information in a supplementary file to that paper. We'll do the same when we publish this. We do not provide exact locational data for any sites. That's redacted to a 10 kilometer to 20 kilometer grid cell or county level data, and that's for security reasons from sites. Thank you all for your patience. I realize it's a lot of maps.